Hello, and thank you for this opportunity to speak about my favourite topic, that is Roman fish sauce. It is a very exciting topic. It's almost fundamental to Roman cuisine, I think, ancient fish sauce. I've been studying Roman recipes for a long time, and it occurred to me eventually that in order to understand the food, I needed to really understand the fish sauce. 10 years ago, I did an MA at Reading University, and I had to have a dissertation, obviously. And so I chose fish sauce, and I started the process of trying to understand it. It's hugely complex. When I started, I had an understanding of the classical literature, i.e. the satire, and I had an understanding of the recipe text, i.e. Apicius. But I needed to understand the fish bones that survive in residues deposited all over the empire and in the processing sites. I needed to understand amphora and amphora typology, hugely complex area, and their function and how their shape determines their function. I needed to understand the production sites themselves. This is southern Spain, North Africa, parts of Italy, Sicily, and the Black Sea. You find these enormous kytaria, these processing tanks where the fish sauce was made. Then we have marine archaeology. We have shipwrecks containing amphora that contain the fish bones. So we have a combination of all three there, trying to understand how the shipwrecks work, where they're found, what they represent in terms of trade. Then the archaeology of the consumption sites, places where fish sauce is sold, where it's somehow transformed at the ports and markets before it is therefore sold, and also where the residues of fish sauce are deposited after it's been consumed. Then we have the complex area of epigraphy, amphora, and particularly the small vessels containing the high-end fish sauces were labelled with really complex structured labels that tell us an awful lot about where it was made, who made it, what kind of fish it was, what quality it was. They need to be understood. Then we have the literature. We have elite satire and things like Pliny and all kinds of histories and descriptions of ancient life. And then we have the didactic literature. We have cookbooks, recipe books, medical books, veterinary books, the kind that actually use fish sauce on a daily basis all the time. And it's just ordinary, and there's no dissembling in didactic literature, which makes it an interesting area to study. Then, of course, modern fish sauce can tell us a great deal about how fish sauces are made today, and also that can inform our understanding of fish sauce in the past. And then, of course, experimental archaeology. So for my dissertation, I made 50 litres of fish sauce in fish tanks in a greenhouse. And I didn't tell my neighbours because it seemed like a good idea, but it didn't actually smell that bad. And I made some really fine quality fish sauce. I was very, very pleased with my fish sauce. So it's a hugely multidisciplinary approach. It's the only way to understand it, and to look at each one in without prejudice, shall we say. So in this presentation we're going to work through the nature of garum itself. What is it? And recognize the fact that it was constantly evolving, and it was very, very difficult to pin down. And so I want to look at how individual kinds of fish sauce were consumed in a given period, what forms and quantities that took. There's an etiquette to consumption that we can see in some of the literature, and consider who consumed which type, and also introduce you to our residue project. So these are some of the quotes from ancient authors about fish sauce. So Pliny, garum is a putrid exudation from fish waste, more expensive than unguent. According to Seneca, it's an expensive bloody mass of decayed fish. Garum sociorum, according to Marshall, was made from the blood of a still bleeding mackerel. And also from Marshall, we get this wonderful word, arcanogaro. Arcane, mysterious, and even sacred. So this is the elite attitude towards fish sauce, which is confused, disturbed, and at the same time expensive and luxurious. So how can it, because it's rotten and disgusting, and they are extremely confused by it. And on the other side, we have quotations from the didactic literature. So Dioscorides, the liquid that comes out of salted flesh or fish, could mean meat as well as fish. According to Isidore Seville, liquamen is little fish dissolved in the process of being salted. And also garum is salted liquid of fish. So there's a kind of dissonance between these two attitudes. And I understood instinctively from looking at the recipes and the way fish sauce was used in the recipes that there were two types, even though for many, and for many still, there's only one type. It's just fish sauce, it's just garum. Actually, there were two types. One was called garum, one was called liquamen, as we will see. So this is how I separate them. Many of my colleagues still do not. So garum, in the Latin period, in the Roman period, was a sauce derived from the blood and viscera from selected fish. Mackerel and tuna dominate, and they are fermented with salt, and it's aged probably. It's described as black and bloody and predominantly a table sauce. So it comes out and is, I think the bottle is handled by the diner. It's not used in the cooking process at all. It's used in blended sauces, but that's a different process. The cooking process, it's not used at all. It was probably invented the end of the 1st century BC. We can't be more precise than the date I have there. And it was almost certainly invented by Marcus Gavius Apicius, the famous Roman gourmet, whose name is attached to the recipe book which survives. And it had quite a small market. It tasted quite strange. It tastes of iron, it tastes of all the blood that's in it. And it's an acquired taste. And you can see the elite attitude towards fish sauce in this particular kind of sauce. Then you have what's called gyros in Greek, transliterated into garum and then ultimately changed into liquamen, is a sauce derived from the fermentation of small and medium-sized whole fish that are dissolved into a clear sauce and a separate fish paste. This is described as nut-coloured by Pliny, and it's also described as leukos in papyri. So somewhat bright rather than white, I would say. And most definitely in contrast to garum, this is the distinction. And the natural colour of a fish sauce when you make it, when I made it, and when other people make it, is amber. And you can see from my picture, this is a mackerel fish sauce, having been taken from the bones, and it begins to settle out with the fish paste floating in the amber liquid. So let's go back to Greece again and follow through the evolution. To start with, gyros in 5th century texts was the name of a small fish that we don't really know, but it was fermented into a fish paste, and it was made, possibly just formed into a fish paste. We don't know that it was fermented, and it was made by the fishermen for their own use from tiny undervalued fish. It was associated with poverty and low value, so it's a very small scale production on the coast, and there is no discernible Mediterranean trade in this product at all. On the other side, we have, amongst elite literature, where consumption of fish liquors are described, halme, or muria as it's called later in Latin, is a liquor derived from the salting of fish. So wet salted fish produces a brine, and that brine is then used as a seasoning liquor. Much later, the fish that dominate in this trade are tuna and mackerel, but in theory, any kind of fish could be salted and used. There's no viscera, so it's completely cleaned of all the blood and viscera. So there is no enzyme hydrolysis. Protein cannot be harvested into the liquor, and there is a delicate flavour, therefore, and probably very little in the way of umami, which is certainly what we expect them to have, what we expect gyros to have and garum to have later. This brine, derived from any kind of fish, was mixed with oil as a dip, and this is described in text. It could also be used neat. There is a widespread trade in this product from the Black Sea and from Spain, because we know that the salted fish from these areas came into the Greek world, into Athens. So here is halme in use. This is Aristophanes. The plot of the play is really not important. What we have is a chorus. So between scenes, we have offstage a kitchen and cooks preparing a feast, and the chorus recites, actually tells the audience what's happening off stage, and they recite a list of repetitive actions, repetitive being the key word here, associated with the kitchen. So fanning the fire, kneading the bread, and beating the Thasian brine with oily headdress. Now the Greek itself is really hard to interpret. I needed my husband, who's a scholar of some note, to translate it for me, but basically oily headdress is what is going on. And it's, as you can see, if you have a fish brine and you have a layer of oil on the top, you need to beat it to make an emulsion for dipping. And I think this is a proto-vinaigrette. Elsewhere in Athenaeus, he describes a situation where a free man dips his food into halme. And the implication that I read from that is that a man who is not considered free does not, and may instead consume garos. That's the implication. So, moving a little bit further forward, we're going to jump to 33 BC to look at what muria, i.e. the fish brine, how that was used in Roman cuisine. This is Horace, and he is describing a philosopher expounding on his knowledge, on his theories for living, except that it's theories for eating. And so he lists lots of really bizarre and unconnected ideas about what the best food is and where to buy it. And he says, it is worth the effort to get to know the nature of the double sauce. Simple sauce is worthy of being made from pure olive oil, which is worthy of being blended with fragrant pure wine and muria, provided that latter comes with a powerful whiff from a Byzantine jar, meaning it's a brine from fish from the Black Sea. And when this is blended with chopped herbs and has come to the boil and it has stood, it is sprinkled with saffron, and when it is left to stand, you can then add the juices of the winefron berry. So you blend the oil in at the end. So this is a Hellenistic use of muria in 1st century BC Rome. There is an understanding from colleagues that muria is just another word for garos, but I think it is at this time anyway, it is a brine from salted fish, and the whole point of it is it is clean and delicate and fresh, and doesn't have umami. So back to the 4th century, Athens, or Greece generally. Philoxenus was a food writer, and according to Athenaeus, he is said to have entered uninvited other people's homes, barged into the kitchen, and seasoned whatever was being cooked there with oil, with garos, with wine, and with vinegar, so that he could correct the seasonings of the household cooks, because he didn't trust the household cooks to have any true knowledge of seasoning. So in theory, garos has evolved from being a fish paste into something that is something that, when it was a fish paste, it was probably unfermented or lightly fermented. And now I think it has been left for longer, and the liquor that is always going to be present when you put fish and salt together becomes more important than the paste. It becomes a liquid seasoning rather than a fish paste for dipping. So it's described as being tasty and useful much later by Alciphron. The point being, I think that it has umami now, and therefore it's very useful to flavour food, and it gives that wonderful burst of flavour, I mean, intensification of flavour, which I think was what was recognised. So this fish sauce, which is now a liquor rather than a paste, arrives in Rome. So garos is transliterated into garum and becomes integral alongside muria with a Hellenistic cuisine that becomes popular and very fashionable. So at this point, we have a huge international trade in Garum, in Garros or Garum. So the amphora are designed specifically for it, and they're found all over the Roman Empire. Everybody knows this. The table jugs that you can see are the ones that in Pompeii were used to serve, not to serve, but to sell, to buy and sell the high-end fish sauces. But these little jugs are not suitable for the table. They are very, very badly put together. This little one, I took this picture of this little one in the Pompeii store, and it is so badly put together. The bottom is just lumps of clay attached. And so I think for most people, fish sauce, when they see it as a guest, as a diner, is going to be in glass, maybe other kinds of ceramic, but they're not ones we recognize. And I think on the other end of the scale, for ordinary people, people go to the market to buy fish sauce, they take their own jug or bottle. In my book, I have a lot of thinking about how amphora were used and how they might have been reused. And so I would be delighted if somebody out there would invite me to speak about amphora reuse. I will say no more. So, garum in the Roman Republic. This is Pliny talking about cabbage. And suddenly, out of the blue, he says, nor did the people approve very highly of cabbage, of cowlays, as they do now. Now, he's writing in the mid-1st century AD. He's looking back into the past. We don't quite know when. I would say the last 200 years of the Republic, so sort of 150s, 200 BC, since the people of that time, the Romans of that time, condemned a pulmentaria, i.e. a relish served with bread, which needed other relishes to get them down, i.e. a sauce. This meant sparing the oil, for the desire for garum was a matter of disapproval. It's a really interesting passage, because not only does it say that garum and oil always go together, and we know they do from other sources, but that you are, it's not popular. It's not something that Republican Romans did, was make a sauce out of oil and garum. It was something that the Greeks did. And there is a sense of, there is a condemnation of Hellenic culinary practices that we see in other texts, particularly from Cato the Elder, who condemns the corruption that is around. And it is seen as coming from Greece, and it is a change in culinary habit that is apparent. And fish sauce clearly is part of that change of culinary habit. Fascinating passage. Whether or not in Republican Italy there was forms of fish sauce made on the coast and used locally by fishermen and their families and their wider community is very hard to tell. It's quite possible. But as far as the food of a sense of what Roman food was like at that time, I don't think it included a lot of fish sauce. So we go back to Horace and 33 BC. This is the other source in Horace. So he's describing a feast given by a guy called Nasadianus. He's a show-off gourmet. He's another kind of gourmet who's expounding on his culinary knowledge to, in this case, bore his guests because they complain. He serves an eel, and the sauce that goes with it is described thus. The ingredients of the sauce are as follows. Oil, again from winafron of the first pressing. Garo de sucis piscis hyberii. Garum from the juices of a Spanish fish. Wine 5 years old, poured in while it is on the boil. After boiling, Chian suits better than anything else. White pepper and vinegar made from fermenting the Lesbian vintage. I was the first to point out that one should boil in the sauce green rocket and bitter allec. So garum from the juices of a Spanish fish. 33 BC. It's a little too early for the black and bloody Garum sociorum. So I think this is just a transliterated garum. It hasn't been turned into liquamen yet. The Spanish fish is probably mackerel. We do find more in this early period, we do find more evidence of mackerel garum, i.e. a dissolved mackerel fish sauce, in the residues, i.e. and a pure mackerel garum at that. And it's, I think, likely to be a very high-end fish sauce, specifically made just from mackerel, because we know that most fish sauce in the later residues are a combination of multiple species, with the occasional use of mackerel if it's a bycatch. But to only make fish sauce from mackerel was very high-end. So this mixture is really quite pleasant. I make it using the vinaigrette ratio of 2 to 1, 2 oil to 1 water-based liquids. So that makes 6 oil to 1 fish sauce, 1 vinegar and 1 sweet wine. And you just blend them together, shake them up in a jar, or you beat them. And that's the point, of course, you can beat them. It's a very, very pleasant sauce. So a couple of hundred years later, looking at Galen, who's writing about the diet and health of ordinary people, very definitely, talking about an impoverished student who, because he was so poor, ate only his vegetables, nothing else. With Garros, of course he ate his vegetables with garum, with Garros, sometimes just adding oil to the Garros, sometimes wine, or again vinegar. But he was so poor he couldn't add all three, and we know from Apicius and from other sources that all three were added to make composite sauces, but we're still basically dealing with the oily headdress, something that needs to be beaten. So here are oenogarum are described in great detail in the recipe collections, in Apicius particularly. And so oenogarum is a collective term to denote all these sauces, regardless of whether they have wine and garum in them. They largely do have wine and garum in them, but lots of other ingredients. But you also find these words which are basically seemingly simpler ideas: oxygarum, vinegar and garum; hydrogarum, water and garum; and garoleon, oil and garum. So lots of different combinations. Always pepper to start. You start with a pepper mash, which you grind into a fine powder and then moisten with fish sauce, and then you add your other herbs and spices: honey, grape syrups, passum, dessert wine. Very rich, very intense sauces. So lots of simple oenogarum in Apicius. Here's a simple way to explain it: an oenogarum for fish, pound pepper roux, stir in some honey, passum, dessert wine, liquamen. Caroenum is a kind of grape juice. Warm it through over the gentlest of fires. And then again, the next recipe in the list, make as above, but when it comes to the boil, you thicken it with starch. So you can have a thin sauce that you dip your food into, and a thick one. And a thick one's great if you're obviously reclining and you're picking up your food with your fingers. A thick one is not going to drip so much on your clothes. That's the theory, I think. So here is a nice description of an oenogarum from Apicius. This is a kind of a frittata. We called it a turned out hors d'oeuvre. So it's got meat, fish, and vegetables in layers, and it's set with eggs. And then it says, make an oenogarum for it like this: pound pepper lovage, pound again, pour on liquamen and wine, flavor with passum or sweet wine, blend it in a little pan, put in a little oil, bring it to heat when it's simmering, thicken with starch. Oenogarum is a Greek word. It's a transliterated Greek word. In the late Empire, when Greek terminology became unfashionable, you had to find new words for all the Greek words that you didn't like. And so it became conditura, impensam, confectio, lots of different ways to describe it, but basically it's just a composite sauce. And one of the things about these composite sauces is you actually use quite a lot of fish sauce. One or two of the recipes actually talks about equal quantities fish sauce and wine and oil. And that makes, if you do that with a squid brand fish sauce, the standard fish sauce that you can buy in the shops, the salt levels are exceptionally high. Southeast Asian fish sauce uses something like 25 to 45% salt as a rule. And that is just impossible. I have in the past recommended that you dilute your ordinary fish sauce with grape juice before you even start to cook with it. Ancient recipes specifically state that fish sauce should be made with 15% salt, which is absolutely perfect for increasing the enzyme activity, which is what dissolves the protein in the fish. And so it makes a much better quality sauce. And of course, it means that it can be used in much greater quantities, which is the key. So lots of different kinds of fish sauce are now available on the market. We've seen the squid brand, you can buy that, that's all right. But there's a lot of people now, a lot of chefs around the world making fish sauce in, some of them claiming that they are a genuine, authentic Roman fish sauce, and some making really good fish sauce that is suitable. So it used to be the case that red boat was my favorite. Red boat, when you first get it, a fresh bottle is amber colored. You can see the light at the bottom of that bottle showing through. This is made by a chap called Quam Pham. He's Vietnamese, but he lives in San Francisco, and he makes it entirely for the American market. Makes it in Vietnam, but then has it pasteurized, I think that's the phrase they use, and then it's shipped into the American market. It's got a protein level of 40 milligrams of protein per liter of fish sauce. It's got an umami kick that you kind of, your eyes pop open when you taste it. And it's the kind of fish sauce that you can taste and eat and enjoy. You can't taste squid brand fish sauce and eat and enjoy. It's a bit, ugh. But red boat is amazing. It's a beautiful sauce. He uses anchovy. He uses, he starts out with about 20% salt, but then he extracts a lot of the salt afterwards. So he gets it down to about 15. And then it can be aged, and it can be aged, and it gets darker and darker the older it gets. And in fact, when a fish sauce is high in protein, it automatically darkens quicker. So, for instance, I have a bottle of squid brand fish sauce now, which is virtually black, and you can't see any light when you hold it up to the light. It's really strange. It's oxidized. Still good, still usable, stronger, fishier, because it never goes off. So I would always recommend, if you can't get any of the others on the list, use red boat. Fleur de garum is made in Cadiz. It's made using an ancient recipe that survives in a Byzantine manuscript, purported to be 2nd century, but actually is a gloss. It's been added later. It uses a lot of medieval spices, which gives us a hint that it's not really a genuine Roman recipe. It uses a lot of herbs, and it interlayers the fish with the salt and the herbs. And the salt is 2 fingers deep. Now, years ago now, I read an article by some archaeologists who made this sauce, and they actually weighed the salt that they used before they put it in at 2 fingers deep, and it almost came out as equal quantities fish and salt. So it's very, very salty. It's an interesting flavor. It is a genuine ancient recipe. It can be bought. It's very, you have to use it in tiny, tiny amounts. Now you can't, I think modern chefs in Cadiz are using it a lot in their cooking, and they enjoy it. They think it's fabulous, and it is, but it's too salty for Roman recipes, and that's the key. So coloratura, equally not really garum. Coloratura is obviously muria. It starts out being muria. Basically, the anchovy are beheaded, eviscerated, and deboned in all in one action. You snap the head off and pull out all the viscera and the bone at the same time. And then they are salted overnight to clean them, to take away all the blood. And then they are salted again and compressed. And the liquor that came out, the filterings of anchovy, as that word means, was the first coloratura. And for probably hundreds of years, that's what it was, a brine, a true muria. But then they decided to change and start to make a stronger, longer fermented fish sauce. But they continued to eviscerate. And so there's no digestive enzymes. And so the protein levels are weak and the umami is weak. But it is fermented for quite a long time. And it does have a nice flavor and a little bit of umami, but not a huge amount. And it is eye-wateringly expensive, £70 a litre. Red boat's about £20 a litre. So bottom right, you can't really see the bottle, I don't think, but escarta is made by a chef in Barcelona called Pere Plonigema, and he is using the leftover viscera and bone and head matter from salted anchovies. He was told and understood that all the leftover, all the rubbish from the fish processing was causing trouble in its disposal, and he decided to make a fish sauce from it. And he uses it in his kitchen, and it can be bought online. It's called escarta. It's very nice, very delicate flavor. And then Ishiri, top right. Ishiri is a Japanese squid viscera and squid ink sauce. It's very different in many respects from a black and bloody garum, but I have made a black and bloody garum using mackerel. I have bled my mackerel, and the taste is distinctively of iron because of all the blood, and Ishiri is distinctively iron in flavor, and so they were very similar, even though Ishiri is not made, it has a long and complicated process of fermentation with a lot of bacterial fermentation, which I don't think was relevant for ancient sauces. It's not easy to be sure. We're not certain about the bacterial fermentation of the black and bloody sauce. There's no evidence at all. But Ishiri takes up to 4 years. It's not easy to get. I had to have it sent to me via a third party, and I have not been able to find it to purchase online at all. But it certainly tastes like a black and bloody garum would taste. The one in the middle, the Lusitanian garum by Can the Can, is my now current favorite fish sauce. This has been made by a chef from Lisbon who runs a restaurant called Can the Can, and he has followed an ancient recipe, i.e. the other recipe that survives from the Geoponica. He's using sardines from the Sardo River, and over time he's actually going to start making this in bulk in Troia, which is the fish sauce factories along the Sardo River. He's going to use food grade bags sitting inside the Kitaria so that the archaeology is preserved, but he's going to make this in bulk. It's an ancient recipe. It uses the right amount of salt. It tastes absolutely delicious. You can literally sup it off your spoon and be delighted by it. Very low salt, high nutrition, perfect. But he's probably not making more than a couple of gallons at a time. It can be bought. Get online and try and find some, because I have a little bottle upstairs and it is just delicious. The most authentic I have tasted so far. So it's possible to get hold of an authentic fish sauce if you try very hard. So going back to acetabulum. The acetabulum is the name of the cup that was used to blend and serve these sauces in Apicius. In Apicius at 225, you put 7 small cups, 7 acetabulum of water to 1 of liquamen, and add the dregs of spice wine, and you have a hydrogarum. Now, this is not a sauce that you would drink, and it's not a sauce you would pour or dip with. It's just a court bouillon. It's a cooking liquor. The water is used. You either poach your meatballs or your fish in the liquor, or you steam them. And so the next one, for a piglet, blend a sauce of pepper, liquamen, and a little wine in an acetabulum and serve it up. Now, an acetabulum comes, according to the recipes, in various sizes. You can have a major, minor, and perquam minor, so large, medium, and small little cup. And ideally, I think the Dragendorf 27 is more suited than any of the other cups to measuring, simply because of that half measure halfway down. It's got that double barrel look about it. It's what we assume, that a cup like that was an acetabulum. And we understand more about an acetabulum from these wonderful phrase books, which I won't pronounce the word at the top, I never do get it right. Phrase books written in Greek and in Latin to facilitate business across the Mediterranean. And they have been wonderfully translated by Eleanor Dickey. And they date from the 2nd to the 6th. We can't be more specific about when the date, but they contain numerous food-related conversations, and food-related conversations concerning fish sauce. And so before a domestic meal, somebody is instructed to open the storeroom, bring out the wine, the oil, the fish sauce, and the beer. So this is not an instruction to the cook. The cook's got his own fish sauce in the kitchen. This is a part of the table accoutrements. We know fish sauce, oil, and wine. Well, fish sauce and oil were actually on the table when you sat down to dine. That's the key. So here's another passage from the phrase books. We have a conversation in a dining room with a student, and he says, excuse my Greek pronunciation, oleogaron eiston ozubathion. Oleogaron obviously is oil and garum, and the ozubathion is the original Greek word for the acetabulum. And so in Latin it's rendered as mite in pensam. Remember, in pensam is one of the words for the oily garum from the late Empire, ad acetabulum. And in English, Dickey renders it as put some fish sauce and oil in the little cup. And then he is instructed to epibapte in tinge, dip it in. And of course, dip it in is, well, it is bread, is meat, is vegetables, or whatever it is you've got to eat. So these sauces were pre-mixed by the cook in a jug, and it was poured into the acetabulum in front of the guest. Maybe that's how it works. Difficult to tell. So dipping is hugely important, and obviously we know this because they're reclining to dine, and you've only got one hand, so you pick up your food with your fingers, and you dip it into the sauce and eat. So this is one of my favorite images of food, the Ostia food bar, 2nd century AD. It's actually a bit longer, and there's a loaf of bread on the right. Then you have a wine cup in the middle with those little bubbles to keep your fingers clean, stop you dropping your glass because of the oil. And then there's a plate of food. So in the middle, there are skewers, clearly kebab skewers, and there's chunks of meat. It's very hard to tell, I know, but they are truly chunks of meat. So we have a proper kebab. To the left of that, we have probably chickpeas or lentils, something like that, and a cup inside. But we have the wine cup already, so it's not a drink. And then on the right, we have what could be a parsnip, it could be a carrot, it's probably a radish. And there's a long tradition of using radish to stimulate the appetite at the beginning of the meal and to dip it into fish sauce. And the cup, even though it's rather taller than one would want, it probably resembles the Dragon 33, i.e. the cup that's got the straight sides. So on the right, we've got an image from the 14th century from Mount Athos, a Byzantine feast in which radish is still served and it's still dipped into fish sauce. And it's dipped into what's called a geraria. Fish sauce, because is in the Byzantine era, is equally as popular and goes right up to the 14th century as an integral part of the food culture. While in the West, of course, it dies out completely by about 600. The geraria is a special dish for heating the fish sauce. So you put charcoal underneath, the fish sauce goes in the top, obviously blended in some way, probably even thickened, and then you can dip your food into it. So these little cups are Terra sigillata. They are, there's an awful lot of research been done by colleagues of mine. Ed Biddulph, who is here tonight and will speak to you later, has done a lot of work on the form and function of these cups using experimental archaeology. He has found that many of the cups are worn, and maybe they are worn because people are beating and blending in them. And also, my dear friend, whose name is hidden behind, and my brain's gone absolutely numb and I can't think what he's called, deeply sorry, who has done in 2018 an awful lot of work on the names of these cups and their associations and their functions. I'm so sorry. I will remember in a minute. So, Jeffrey Dannell, thank you. I'm sorry, Jeffrey. Oh. It is very difficult to attribute specific fixed roles to each of these shapes, as they are seemingly to me so similar. They are small cups. They come in various sizes, but basically, because of the shape, I don't think you can say that this one is for drinking and this one is for saucers. I suspect they were all at some point used as an acetabulum, i.e. a little cup. And one of the issues in relation to amphora that I discovered is that the potter can have a very distinct and specific role in mind when he makes his vessel. But once it leaves his shop and goes off, anybody can use it in any way they want. So I suspect Dragon 27, i.e. the one with the double barrel, was not used for drinking, but it may have been used, as Ed has suggested, for blending wine and honey, because mulsum may have been drunk in much smaller quantities. But I suspect interchangeable role. So there are kiln loads. These are plates inscribed with the graffiti of what was inside the kiln. And acetabulum occurs along with another word, liquae, and they're assumed to be cups. And as Ed has pointed out, there are particular types of ware on these cups. You find two types. You find the central area of the dish, if it's a 27, has been worn away. And if they're the 33 with the straight sides, then it's the bottom of the wall and the edge of the base where it meets that it's worn away. And Ed has suggested that it's potentially something to do with mixing wine and honey for mulsum, stirring oil and fish sauce and wine together. And as we've described it, we've got our oily headdress and we need to beat it out. It doesn't stay stable for long and you continuously beating it, maybe. Because if you don't beat it, the oil stays on the surface and when you dip, all you get is oil. You need to get the flavour underneath. Ed concluded that the inhabitants of Britain were conversant with Roman ways of cooking and dining, which absolutely I agree. But can we demonstrate that that's been happening? And Ed and I were talking about this and sharing information about this for years. And then this project came on the internet and I was very intrigued by it. It came out of the University of New York. They wanted to get specialists in archaeology, history and science to work with chefs to cooperate on a research project that was focused on food and food of the ancient world, and to create a consumable product and to serve that product in New York. So what's not to like? We thought let's get together and present a project. And so myself, Ed, and Alexander Pecci from the University of Barcelona and a friend called Kathy Kaufman, who's also a food historian, got together over this. Alexander Pecci is a very well-known, very well-respected residue specialist working with pottery. So we developed a plan. We would prepare, our food product would be to prepare a number of oenogarum from replicas and particularly the Horace, the two sources you saw earlier, and serve them in replica acetabulum to the people in New York. That would be a simple thing for we to do. But also to obtain a number of the original pieces of Samian cup to test for residues, to see whether residues would penetrate and to see whether the ones that were worn would actually penetrate better. And also over time to prepare oenogarum in replicas to duplicate the conditions to see whether or not we can get a really good signal from the residues as to what would be penetrate the surface of the pot. So here we are in the kitchens in New York, serving our food. It was a great success. Everybody loved the fish sauce. Everybody was fearful of the fish sauce because everybody is always fearful at first, and then they realise that it's really nice. So Ed got his selection of pots from Roman Southwark from the Thameslink project, which he worked on, of course. And he's going to tell you a bit more about it shortly. So we know fish sauce was consumed in Roman Southwark. We find Beltran 2A amphora that have fish sauce residues in them. And we also find the residues of fish sauce discarded along the Thames wall. So we know there was a market for fish sauce in London. And the Thameslink project had, this is Ed's slide really, significant Roman remains and artifacts, military features, pre and post Boudiccan, clay and timber buildings along a main road and potentially side roads, a probable high status bathhouse, and for more importantly for our study, the site demonstrated social variability. So we could possibly see Romano-British people not acquiring Roman behaviour, Romanization by any other name. So we wanted to determine whether the Samian acetabulum were potentially used to blend fish-based sauces in Roman Britain in imitation of the culinary practices that we assume were going on in Italy. Because we haven't tested any of the Italian pots, we don't know that for sure. Residue testing, of course, in Samian ware has been assumed to be unhelpful because of the slip. But because of the ware, we thought we'd get away with finding some examples. And Alexander Pecci from the University of Barcelona carried out our testing. And here's our samples that we got from the archaeological site. And this is the point where I read out gas chromatography and mass spectrometry, but otherwise I do not know what happens. It's a magic thing that happens. But Alexander has tested the first six pieces. Here's our samples. Some are worn, some were unworn, and there was a lot of wide date range, mostly residual in the sense that they were 3rd century, and we know these pots start to die out by the end of the 2nd. So this is Alexander's slide. Preliminary analysis indicate that most of the vessels preserve scarce residues, possibly due to the characteristic of the vessel, the fine fabric and the surface slip. So there wasn't a lot of residue. We didn't expect a lot. But just one Dragendorf 33 had abundant residues. Now, it's very difficult with this kind of analysis. This is what Alexander has told us. She was able to identify an animal origin content. She couldn't determine whether it was fish or meat. She also found tartaric acid, which was a marker for grape, but she couldn't find what she expected, which was the marker for fermentation. So it's compatible with an animal origin sauce mixed with grape juice. And in other vessels, Dragendorf 27 particularly, there is residues compatible with plant oils, meaning oil, meaning olive oil possibly. So we have the potential for different kinds of sauces. However, this is preliminary. So residue analysis part 1, we need more vessels. We have a call for cups. If anybody has any Dragendorf 27, 24 and 33 lying around in their museums, in their archaeological sites, we would be happy to test them. And the second part of our project ongoing, I have prepared replica vessels. I have worn them down, as you can see, in the same way as they are found in archaeology. I have stored saucers in them for 6 months. I have buried those pots in a compost heap for 6 months, and they are currently with Alexandra, and she is waiting to be able to test them. All the testing so far that Alexandra has done has been piggybacked on other projects, but we can't do that anymore. We need to actually pay for our tests. So seek funding to cover the cost of our analysis, obtain more cups, and publish our results is our future plan. And I believe that's my last slide. Yes. Thank you very much for your time and interest. And I look forward to questions, and I look forward to hearing from Ed too, because I know he's here.